2 years ago, this place looked like silence. No skyline, no smokestacks, no traffic, just sand, wind, and distance. Today, it's one of the most aggressive statements of industrial intent on Earth. The Midong Solar Complex in Xinjiang, measured in gigawatts, not megawatts. Reports put its generation capacity around 3.5 GW, which is the kind of number you normally associate with a cluster of power stations, not a single solar site. But what matters isn't the spectacle. What matters is why China is building projects like this at a pace the rest of the world struggles to match. Because for decades, China's greatest strategic weakness wasn't the military. It wasn't demographics. It wasn't even debt. It was energy. China is the world's factory. And factories don't run on slogans. They run on fuel, cheap, predictable, continuous fuel. For most of modern history, the superpowers that lasted weren't just strong armies. They were the ones that could keep the lights on, keep steel flowing, keep transport moving, even when rivals tried to squeeze them. China has never truly had that luxury. In 2024, China imported about 11.1 million barrels per day of crude oil, making it the world's largest crude importer. And crucially, this is not a comfortable dependence. This is the kind of dependence that shapes a country's entire foreign policy. Because the oil doesn't teleport into refineries. It travels. And travel has geography. And geography has choke points. Zoom out from Xinjiang. Pull back from the solar panels. Follow the energy that still powers the arteries of China's economy. Shipping, trucking, petrochemicals, aviation, parts of heavy industry. Much of it still depends on oil. Now trace the path of that oil. Most of China's crude imports arrive by sea. One major analysis notes roughly 90% of China's crude oil imports were seaborne in 2024, with the remainder arriving overland via pipelines from neighbors like Russia and Central Asia. That seaborne flow is China's oxygen line. And like any oxygen line, it has a weak point. The Strait of Malacca, a narrow maritime bottleneck threading between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, one of the most strategically loaded pieces of water on the planet. Multiple analyses commonly cite that around 80% of China's oil imports transit through Malacca. Here's the part most people miss. This isn't just a shipping concern, it's a state survival concern. Because if you're Beijing, you look at Malacca and you don't see a trade route, you see a switch, and you don't control the switch. In a crisis, especially a crisis involving Taiwan, Chinese planners have to consider a nightmare scenario. A military confrontation where the US and allies can pressure Chinese shipping, insurance, logistics, and maritime access in ways that don't even require striking the Chinese mainland. This is why you hear the phrase Malacca dilemma referenced in discussions of Chinese strategy. A recognition that a single choke point can become a lever against the world's second-largest economy. China Power Project. Now, pause here because the story is not China would collapse tomorrow. It's more dangerous than that. A full shutdown is not the only threat. A partial squeeze, delays, risk premiums, supply uncertainty can do huge damage to an economy built around speed and margins. China's manufacturing system is famous for scale, but it's also famous for timing. If energy becomes expensive or unpredictable, it doesn't just reduce profit. It disrupts orders, shifts, exports, and jobs. It weakens the implicit bargain many governments rely on: stability, growth, and rising living standards in exchange for political control. So Beijing faces a brutal equation. China wants strategic freedom. Strategic freedom requires energy security. Energy security is compromised by imported oil and sea choke points. And that brings us to the real meaning of these giant renewable projects. They are not only climate policy, they are industrial policy. They are security policy. They are foreign policy. They are Beijing trying to redesign its economy so that the most critical parts of national power can function even if the sea lanes are contested. And the core strategy is almost shockingly simple. Move as much of the economy as possible onto electricity. Then generate that electricity domestically at scale. Because electricity, unlike oil, can be produced from many sources: coal, hydro, nuclear, wind, solar. And most importantly, it can be produced inside China's borders and moved across China's territory. This is why China's electrification drive matters more than 1,000 speeches. Look at transport first, because transport is where oil's grip is most personal. In 2024, China's electric car market accelerated dramatically. The International Energy Agency reports that China's electric car sales surged, and that on a monthly basis, electric car sales overtook conventional car sales starting mid-2024, bringing the EV share close to 50% for the full year by their reporting. IEA, read that again. In the largest car market on Earth, EVs began outselling gasoline cars month after month. That's not a trend. That's a structural shift. And when you scale that across buses, scooters, delivery fleets, municipal vehicles, and increasingly long-distance trucking pilots, you start to see what Beijing is building. A transport system that gradually drinks less imported oil and consumes more domestically generated electricity. In strategic terms, it's like replacing a vulnerable supply line with an internal circuit. But there's a catch, and it's a big one. Electrification doesn't automatically mean clean. If you electrify everything while your grid is still dominated by coal, you may reduce oil dependence, yet deepen coal dependence. And China still relies heavily on coal in its power system. Energy analysts tracking China's electricity mix show that coal remains a major share, even as low-carbon generation rises. For example, Ember's 2024 data puts low-carbon electricity at about 38%, which is huge, but also implies the rest is still largely fossil generation. So China's challenge becomes a two-front war. 1. Replace oil where possible by electrifying demand. 2. Replace coal over time by scaling low-carbon supply fast enough to keep up with rising electricity consumption. That second part is where the story becomes almost unbelievable, because China isn't just adding renewables. It's rebuilding the entire physical architecture of power. A country can install solar panels and wind turbines and still fail. Because generation isn't the only problem. The real problem is this: power isn't useful where it's produced. It's useful where it's consumed. China's best solar and wind resources are often far from its biggest industrial and population centers. Western deserts, northern plains, offshore zones. Meanwhile, the heaviest electricity demand sits in the east and south, dense megacities, coastal manufacturing belts, export hubs. So if you want renewables to matter, not on paper, but in the real economy, you need the ability to move enormous amounts of electricity across enormous distances. That's why China has invested so heavily in ultra-high voltage transmission. This is the unglamorous part of the energy transition that most people ignore. But it's where the deep dive lives. Grid infrastructure is power. China's UHV program includes massive lines stretching well over 1,000 kilometers, engineered to move electricity from remote generation zones to coastal demand centers. Wikipedia and academic reviews note the scale is enormous. Tens of thousands of kilometers of UHV lines in operation, backed by very large cumulative investment. Science Direct. When you build that kind of backbone, renewables stop being a regional experiment and start becoming a national weapon. But even transmission isn't enough. Renewables are variable. Solar peaks at midday. Wind comes in waves. Hydro is seasonal. Demand peaks at night, during heat waves, during industrial surges. So you need storage, balancing, and dispatchability. Or the system curtails clean power, wasting what it generated. China has been scaling grid storage and integration mechanisms alongside renewable build-out for years, and the IEA highlights China's central role in global renewable capacity expansion and improved system integration. IEA. In other words, this is not China installed a lot of solar. This is China is engineering an entire energy system that can support an electrified industrial economy. Now, let's bring this back to geopolitics. If China succeeds, if it can push a larger share of transport, heating, and industrial processes onto electricity, and if it can keep growing low-carbon generation while managing coal, Then one of the oldest pressure points against China weakens, the ability to threaten its oil lifeline. That doesn't mean China becomes invulnerable. Far from it. It still imports raw materials. It still depends on export markets. It still needs shipping lanes for trade. A blockade impacts far more than energy. But energy is special because energy is the base layer of everything else. And Beijing treats it like the base layer. This is why giant solar deserts aren't just climate optics. They are a strategic hedge against maritime coercion. And then the ambition expands even further, because Beijing isn't only trying to secure its own energy. It's also trying to dominate the supply chains that power everyone else's transition. Lithium, graphite, rare earths, battery production, solar manufacturing, these aren't green business sectors anymore. They are geopolitical assets. They are leverage. And here's the twist. If the world shifts away from oil, the map of power doesn't become neutral, it gets redrawn. Oil states lose leverage. Manufacturing states with clean tech supply chains gain leverage. And the countries that control the inputs, minerals, processing, components, start holding the new choke points. If energy independence were only about producing electricity, the story would already be impressive. But Beijing's strategy goes further, much further. Because China isn't just trying to secure its own energy future. It's trying to shape the future energy system of everyone else. To understand why that matters, you have to shift perspective. Oil dominance wasn't just about having oil. It was about controlling the infrastructure, finance, shipping, insurance, pricing benchmarks, and security architecture around oil. The countries that shaped that ecosystem didn't just sell fuel, they shaped geopolitics for decades. China learned that lesson. And instead of fighting yesterday's war, it decided to build tomorrow's choke points. The global energy transition rests on a handful of physical inputs. Not abstract ideals, physical things you have to dig out of the ground, refine, manufacture, and assemble at scale. Lithium for batteries, graphite for anodes, nickel and cobalt for energy density, rare earth elements for motors, wind turbines, and precision electronics, copper for everything that carries electricity, from grids to vehicles. Here's the uncomfortable reality. China dominates much of this chain. Not necessarily because it has the most reserves, but because it invested early, at scale, and with state backing in processing and manufacturing, where value and leverage actually concentrate. In mining, China often plays a secondary role. In refining, it plays a primary one. In battery supply chains, Chinese firms refined the industrial playbook, secure raw material access globally, build refining capacity domestically, scale manufacturing relentlessly, then push prices down until competitors struggle to survive. This is why China produces the majority of the world's lithium-ion batteries. Why it manufactures most solar modules. Why it is a central supplier for wind turbine components. This wasn't accidental, it was policy. While many countries treated renewables as a climate add-on, something to encourage with incentives, China treated them as a strategic industry, no different from steel, shipbuilding, or semiconductors. And it shows. When costs collapsed for solar panels and batteries over the last decade, that wasn't just technological progress. It was industrial warfare by pricing. Chinese firms, backed by state credit and scale, absorbed losses, outlasted rivals, and rewrote global cost curves. By the time many Western governments realized what was happening, their domestic manufacturing bases had already hollowed out. Now, fast forward to the present. Countries across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia are racing to electrify transport, decarbonize grids, and reduce fossil fuel dependence. But here's the paradox. To escape oil dependence, they often deepen dependence on Chinese clean tech supply chains. Panels, cells, motors, inverters, grid components. This is the strategic tension at the heart of the energy transition. And Beijing understands it perfectly. Which brings us to the United States and the problem of inconsistency. Washington does understand the risk. That's why recent years saw a surge in industrial policy aimed at reshoring clean tech manufacturing, protecting domestic industries, and reducing exposure to Chinese supply chains. subsidies, tariffs, local content rules, technology restrictions. On paper, it looks like a comprehensive response. But strategy isn't just about policies, it's about time horizons. Energy systems aren't rebuilt in election cycles. They're rebuilt over decades. And this is where China and the United States diverge sharply. Beijing sends a stable signal: long-term direction, national priority, policy continuity. Washington sends mixed signals: aggressive support followed by reversal risk, depending on political turnover. For private industry, that difference matters more than ideology. If you're building a battery factory, a transmission network, or a mineral processing plant, you don't just ask, "Is this profitable?" You ask, "Will this policy environment exist in 10 years?" China answers that question clearly. The US often doesn't. This uncertainty creates friction. Capital hesitates, projects are slow. Supply chains remain exposed longer than planned. And that creates space for China. Because even if the US eventually builds domestic capacity, the transition period still matters. During that window, China can entrench itself further as the default supplier. And once supply chains are embedded, unwinding them is expensive, slow, and politically painful. This is how leverage forms, not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet dependency. Now let's zoom out again, back to geopolitics. Energy independence doesn't mean isolation. No major economy is fully self-sufficient. What it means is resilience. The ability to absorb shocks. The ability to operate under pressure. The ability to deny rivals easy leverage. China's energy strategy is built around that logic. Electrify demand, domesticize generation, control supply chains, reduce exposure to choke points, increase strategic optionality. From Beijing's perspective, this isn't about tomorrow. It's about the moment when pressure is applied. Taiwan is often discussed in military terms: ships, missiles, aircraft, but energy sits beneath all of it. A China that fears energy strangulation must calculate carefully. A China that believes it can endure disruption calculates differently. That doesn't make conflict inevitable, but it changes risk tolerance. And this is where narratives matter. If China can convince itself and others that it is no longer uniquely vulnerable to energy coercion, then the strategic environment shifts, even before a single policy is tested. At the same time, the energy transition reshapes global winners and losers. Oil exporters face long-term demand uncertainty. Manufacturing powers with clean tech dominance gain influence. Countries without minerals, processing capacity, or industrial scale must choose between dependency and investment. This is why energy policy is no longer a technical debate. It is industrial strategy. It is security doctrine. It is power projection by other means. And it explains why the deserts of Xinjiang, the grids of eastern China, the battery plants of Guangdong, and the mines of Africa are all connected, part of the same system. The mistake is to view China's renewable build-out as idealism. It isn't. It's realism, executed at scale. That doesn't mean it will succeed without friction. Coal dependence remains a challenge. Grid balancing is complex. Demographics, debt, and external pressures still matter. But the direction is clear. China is attempting something unprecedented: to reduce the strategic importance of oil in its economy while becoming indispensable to the post-oil world. Whether that attempt fully succeeds is still an open question. But the effort alone is already reshaping markets, alliances, and assumptions. And for the rest of the world, the lesson is uncomfortable but necessary. The energy transition is not just about saving the planet. It's about who controls the systems that replace the old one. And in that contest, hesitation is costly. This is Deep Dive Chronicles. If you want to understand the future of power, you don't just watch who drills more wells. You watch who builds the systems no one else can live without.